A man with no tongue collapsed on her exam table, chest torn open, eyes pleading. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But the map he drew in his own blood changed everything. What Carmen Alvarez thought was a routine night at a desert clinic became the opening move in a decades-buried conspiracy involving missing soldiers, stolen military payroll, and something not entirely human buried beneath the sand. She wasn't supposed to see the map. She wasn't supposed to dig, but she did. And now, something that listens is awake, and it remembers. The desert had a way of keeping secrets. It wasn't just the heat, though that was cruel enough, or the wind, which carried dust like whispers and sand like scars. It was something deeper, something in the silence between gusts, the stillness after sunset, the way nothing ever seemed truly dead or truly alive, the kind of silence where buried things stayed buried. Unless someone was foolish enough to dig. Carmen Alvarez wasn't looking to dig anything up when she found him. She was 3 weeks into her shift at the remote outpost clinic in Aretas, a forgotten town in the middle of nowhere that had more lizards than people and a single dirt road that stretched out like a dried vein in every direction. Her job wasn't glamorous. Patch up scorpion bites, treat heat stroke, sew up the occasional bar fight, check pulses, clean wounds, keep people alive until they could get somewhere real. But that night, just past sundown, someone banged on the clinic door hard enough to rattle the walls. Carmen had been reading a dog-eared mystery novel. She dropped it and ran to the door. What she found made her freeze. It wasn't just the blood, it was the look in his eyes. He collapsed into her arms before she could speak. He was tall, heavy in her grasp, built like someone who'd been strong once and hadn't eaten in days. His clothes were shredded, ripped, and burned in places. His face was caked with dust and blood. The wound in his side was deep and clean, like someone had driven something sharp and deliberate between his ribs. Carmen dragged him into the exam room, called out for Jimmy, the night security guy, and got to work. She cut away the fabric, sterilized what she could, and stopped the bleeding before it bled him dry. He never made a sound, not even a groan. Only his eyes moved, flitting open in brief bursts, wild and glassy, as if he couldn't believe where he was. By the time she was stitching the wound, she realized something strange. He hadn't spoken a word. Not during the pain, not when she asked his name, not when she pressed on his throat to check for swelling. She gently parted his lips and drew back. He had no tongue, not cut, not burned, just gone. Smooth scar tissue where it should have been, as though it had been taken long ago. She stood still, holding her breath. Jimmy stepped into the room. "Jesus," he said, "where'd this guy come from?" Carmen looked at the man again. "I don't know, but somebody tried to kill him." The man stirred, trying to sit up. Hey, don't," Carmen said, pressing him gently back. "You're safe. You lost a lot of blood. I don't know what happened to you. But you're not going anywhere tonight." He looked at her. Something sharp behind the eyes. Then he reached for the tray beside her, shaking fingers smearing blood as he grabbed a gauze pad. He pointed at the surgical marker. Carmen hesitated, then handed it to him. With slow, trembling precision, he began to draw. Not words, a map. It wasn't like any map Carmen had seen before. There were no names, just lines, ridges, a symbol like a spiked sun, 3 dots in a triangle, and then a box drawn with tight, deliberate angles, a square surrounded by hash marks and strange arrows, and in the center of it he marked a large X. He underlined it 3 times, then looked at her, desperately. Carmen felt her heart start to race. "What is this?" He didn't answer, of course. He couldn't. But the way he stared at the paper, then at her, made something stir in the pit of her stomach. He wanted her to go there, or someone. And whatever was there, it was buried. She looked again at the symbols. Military, maybe. Some kind of base? She didn't know. But the man was already slipping into unconsciousness, breathing shallow. Before his eyes closed, he grabbed her wrist and tapped twice, hard. Urgent! Then he was out. Carmen stood frozen in that exam room, holding a bloody napkin that might have been directions to something long forgotten, something someone had killed to protect. She didn't know why she felt it, but she knew this map wasn't just a warning, it was a key, and somebody had just handed it to her. Carmen stared at the napkin in her hand, the marker ink already starting to blur beneath a smear of blood. The crude map burned into her memory with uncomfortable clarity. She didn't know what the symbols meant, not exactly, but something about the drawing made her skin prickle. It wasn't just the way the X was drawn so deliberately, nor the symbols that felt too practiced to be imagined. It was the urgency in the man's eyes. He hadn't spoken a word, couldn't have, even if he tried. And yet the message he'd left behind screamed louder than anything she'd heard in weeks. She looked over at him, unconscious now, his chest rising in shallow breaths, the bandages pressed tight against his side. Whoever he was, he hadn't just stumbled into the clinic by accident. He'd come here for a reason, to find her, to give her that map. She tucked the napkin into a clean evidence pouch from the supply closet, sealed it, and dropped it into the back pocket of her jeans. Jimmy, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, arched an eyebrow. "You're not thinking of going out there, are you?" Carmen turned, trying to mask the heat rising in her chest. "I don't know what I'm thinking yet, but it's not nothing." He shook his head. "People show up hurt all the time out here. Coyotes, gangs, dehydration. Doesn't mean we start chasing ghosts in the dirt." "You didn't see his eyes," she said quietly. "He didn't just want help. He wanted me to see that map." Jimmy frowned, but didn't argue. He knew her well enough by now to recognize that tone. Carmen Alvarez didn't chase shadows. She stitched skin, wrote detailed reports, kept her head down. She didn't believe in lost treasures or whispered legends. Which is why her conviction now made the whole thing feel heavier. She waited until dawn before making her move. The man, still unnamed, had stabilized overnight. She checked his vitals, changed his bandage, left a note on the clipboard for the morning staff, and then walked out the back door before anyone could stop her. Her truck coughed to life like an old man waking up from a nightmare, tires crunching against the dirt as she drove east toward the edge of the town and into the flat, sun-scorched horizon. She had the napkin folded on the dash, and every time she looked at it, the details seemed to grow more precise. She passed the old water tower, the dry gulch, the broken sign that once read, "Danger, Military Restricted Zone," before time and wind stripped it to a few rusted letters. The further she drove, the less the world seemed real, like she was sliding into a dream layered over the bones of something older. By mid-morning, she reached the base of a ridge that matched the strange angle drawn on the napkin. Carmen parked the truck, grabbed her canteen, gloves, and a small folding shovel she kept in the back seat, and began hiking. The heat rolled in waves, dry and thick, but her mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Every step was fueled by something deeper than curiosity. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know what waited beneath the dirt. But her hands trembled with the sense that this moment, this exact path, was one she had already been walking her whole life without knowing it. She reached a small clearing around noon. The wind had calmed, the sun bore down without mercy. But there it was, the 3 stones just as marked on the napkin, arranged in a tight triangle. In the center, hard-packed earth that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Carmen knelt, heart hammering, and dug. The shovel bit into the dirt with steady rhythm, her breaths sinking to the scrape and toss of each stroke. An hour passed, then 2. Sweat soaked her shirt. Dust caked her throat. Still, she dug. She almost gave up until the metal rang, a low, hollow clunk. She froze. Dug faster. Then uncovered a rusted metal box the size of a suitcase, edges rounded, military green faded to a dull gray. Her pulse spiked. She cleared the rest of the dirt, wiped the latch clean, and pried it open. In laid bundles of canvas-wrapped parcels, sealed, stamped, each one marked with an old military insignia, each one stuffed tight with cash, U.S. Army payroll. Dozens of envelopes, maybe hundreds, and on the inside of the lid, scratched crudely with something sharp, a name, Sergeant M. Dyer. She stared. Dyer. The name felt familiar. From the town's old archives? A veteran whose file she'd seen? She didn't have time to consider it further. Behind her, a shadow fell across the pit. She turned slowly and saw 3 men standing at the ridge, dressed in black, guns drawn. Carmen didn't speak. She didn't move. The box of Army payroll was still open beside her, glittering beneath the sun like a trap sprung too late. The 3 men stepped closer, boots crunching the dry earth, weapons aimed squarely at her chest. The one in the middle, lean with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes like granite, spoke first. "Step away from the box." His voice was flat, practiced, too calm for the situation. Carmen's fingers twitched near the edge of the shovel. Not a weapon. Not enough. She raised both hands slowly, backing away. "I didn't know what it was," she said. "I was following a map," the man finished for her, "drawn by someone you shouldn't have helped." His eyes narrowed. "Where is he?" Carmen said nothing. The man motioned with his rifle. One of the others moved forward and yanked the napkin from her pocket. He unfolded it and held it up against the light, nodding once. "Same pattern," he muttered. "She found it." The leader turned his gaze back to her. "What did he tell you?" Carmen shook her head. "He can't talk. He has no tongue." The man didn't react. And yet he still managed to say too much. He gestured at the box. "Do you know what this is?" "Army payroll," she replied quietly. "Old. Buried. Why?" "Because it wasn't supposed to be found," he said, stepping closer. "That money went missing in 1987, stolen from a transport truck heading out of Fort Daly. 5 soldiers disappeared. 1 was later found dead. The others, ghosts. Some say they split the money and vanished. Others say they turned on each other. But nobody ever found the cash. Until now." Carmen's mouth was dry. "So what are you? Army? Feds?" The man smirked. "We're the kind of people who make sure things stay buried." He lifted the rifle a fraction higher. "And people who get curious don't live very long." Carmen's eyes flicked toward the shovel. No chance. They'd shoot her before she could move. The second man moved toward the box, reached in, and began pulling out the parcels of money. He checked each one, then nodded. "It's all here?" The leader lowered his gun slightly. "You're lucky we found you before someone else did. You're going to forget this ever happened. You're going to get in your truck and drive away. You never saw him. You never came here. If we even hear your name again, you disappear. Got it?" Carmen nodded slowly. Her chest burned with fury. But she wasn't stupid. Not yet. The men gathered the box, resealed it, and started hauling it toward a matte black Jeep parked just beyond the ridge. Carmen stayed where she was, fists clenched, watching them vanish into the heat waves, knowing something bigger had just passed inches from her face. She waited until they were gone. Then she stood and walked back to her truck. She didn't go home. She went back to the clinic, and he was gone. The room was empty, the bandages left behind, the sheets rumpled. No blood trail, no sign of a struggle, just absence. Jimmy shrugged when she demanded answers. "He left maybe an hour after you, walked out on his own, still limping but upright. Didn't say a word, didn't leave a note." Carmen sat on the edge of the exam table, the same one she'd stitched him up on. Her hand brushed something beneath the pillow. She reached under and pulled out another napkin. This one had no map, just a symbol, a triangle made of 3 interlocking lines. She didn't recognize it, but something about it made her skin crawl. There was one more thing under the pillow, a dog tag. Carmen turned it over. Dyer, M. The same name scratched into the lid of the buried box. The man she patched up, the one without a tongue, the one who'd nearly died to deliver her that map, had been Sergeant M. Dyer, one of the missing soldiers, and he was still alive, which meant he hadn't stolen the payroll, he'd buried it to keep it hidden, and someone else had killed to find it. That night, Carmen couldn't sleep. She turned the dog tag over and over in her hand, staring at the triangle symbol drawn on the napkin. It wasn't a military mark, not officially, but she remembered seeing it once, years ago, in an old news clipping buried deep in the town archives. It was tied to a group, a shadow division, rumored to have operated off the books. Military contractors, deep black, designed to recover stolen assets, suppress stories, make loose ends vanish. They were ghosts, and they were still active. Dyer had trusted her, given her the map, brought her into a story that hadn't ended in 1987 but had only gone quiet. That buried box wasn't the treasure, it was the bait, and the men who showed up hadn't just been looking to erase evidence. They were tying up a chain that had unraveled. She wondered where Dyer had gone. If he was still out there, watching, waiting, planning his next move. Carmen didn't know, but she knew this: she wasn't walking away, not anymore. Carmen drove until the sun dipped low and smeared the sky in streaks of copper and blood. The desert around her pulsed with silence, that eerie kind that only places touched by violence could carry. Her thoughts rolled in chaotic loops. Dyer's eyes, the carved dog tag, the triangle symbol, and the men with calm voices and loaded guns. She had walked into something massive, older than she'd realized, older even than the buried payroll. And someone, Dyer, had trusted her to carry it forward. But what exactly was she carrying? And why her? She reached the end of the old service road, tires crunching to a stop beside a rusted-out communications tower, long decommissioned. She stepped out into the thickening dark, her boots kicking up little puffs of sand. The wind was beginning to rise. There was a tension in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out the dog tag again. Dyer's name. The smooth edge of the metal dug against her fingers. She clutched it like a question and stared up at the half-lit tower. This place wasn't on any current map, but it was marked, faintly, on Dyer's napkin. A tiny circle near the triangle of stones. No label, no explanation, just a point. She walked toward the tower, the creaking steel humming like it remembered being useful. Beneath its base was a hatch half covered by sand and warped by time. Carmen cleared the dirt with her foot, bent down, and pried it open. The air that came up was cold, unexpected. Below, a ladder disappeared into darkness. She flicked on her flashlight and hesitated. She could still leave, drive away, pretend this was someone else's war. But she didn't. She climbed down. The rungs were rusted and slick with grit, but held. At the bottom, the beam of her flashlight cut through thick, unmoving air. A tunnel stretched out ahead, concrete walls, metal piping, old utility markings worn nearly invisible. This was military, all right, hidden, off-grid, forgotten to time and memory, until now. She walked. Her footsteps echoed too loud. After about 200 feet, she reached a steel door. Unlike the rest, it wasn't rusted. It had been maintained, recently. Carmen's stomach flipped. She pressed her ear against it and heard humming. Electricity. She didn't hesitate. She turned the handle and pushed. Inside was a room, small, lit by a single low bulb, and in the center, seated calmly at a steel table like he'd been waiting years, was Dyer. He looked better, cleaner. His side was still wrapped, but his eyes were sharp, alert. He looked up and met her gaze without surprise. Carmen stepped forward. "You're alive." He nodded. His throat worked like he wanted to speak, but of course he couldn't. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. Carmen picked it up, unfolding it carefully. Another map, but not of the desert. This one was a floor plan, underground. She scanned it quickly. Storage rooms, surveillance bays, exit points. One room was labeled in a bold black marker, Army Payroll Hold, Org 6. Next to it, confiscated docks. She looked back at Dyer. There's more? He tapped the table once, then twice, then 3 times, then pointed at a second mark on the map. Carmen understood. There had been more than one cache, maybe 3, maybe 6. The one she'd uncovered was only part of it, the smallest piece. The money, yes, but also documents, records, proof. She sat across from him. They're still hunting you? He nodded again, then reached under the table and pulled out a faded envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white. Men in uniform standing beside unmarked trucks, others digging, loading crates. One image showed a younger Dyer with a group of 4 other soldiers smiling in front of a camo tent. Carmen's throat tightened. These were the others, she murmured. Dyer held up 4 fingers, then curled 2 of them down. 2 dead, 2 missing, 1 left, her. Carmen looked back down at the photo. She could feel the scope of it now, an entire operation lost to history, buried beneath lies, greed, and silence. Dyer and his unit had been tasked with protecting something, not stealing it. But someone else had decided that silence was more valuable than service, and Dyer had paid the price. She looked him in the eye. Why me? He stared for a long moment, then pointed at her chest, not at her heart, her badge, her clinic ID, which still dangled from her jacket collar. He tapped it, then tapped his head. Carmen understood. He'd been watching, waiting for someone who didn't look the other way, someone who helped first and asked later, someone who still gave a damn. He had chosen her because she had patched him up, no questions asked, because she had looked him in the eye when he had no voice, because she had followed the trail he laid down when anyone else would have run. She stood. Where's the rest? Dyer smiled, just barely. Then he pulled open a side drawer and handed her a small leather-bound notebook. She flipped through it. Coordinates, names, call signs, supply routes, all of it written in precise military shorthand, the story of a payroll gone rogue and the men who had tried to bury it. She looked up at him again. If I take this, I don't stop, do I? He shook his head, then leaned forward slowly, deliberately. He pressed his palm to the table and dragged a finger in a slow arc, drawing something. She watched. A symbol. Not the triangle this time. A circle, unbroken. He tapped it, then pointed at her. Carmen exhaled. She tucked the notebook into her bag. All right then, she whispered. Let's dig up everything. And for the first time since she'd found the map, she saw peace in Dyer's eyes. The days that followed blurred into motion, quiet, relentless, calculated. Carmen didn't return to the clinic. She didn't go home. She sent a brief, coded message to Jimmy telling him not to ask questions, that she was safe, and that he shouldn't try to find her. Then she left Aretas altogether, heading deeper into the desert's forgotten territories with Dyer's notebook as her compass. The entries weren't dated, but they were detailed, pages of tight handwriting, military grid references, cryptic notes about supply drops, patrol rotations, unregistered installations. A war hidden beneath the real war. Some pages were torn, others scorched. One had what looked like dried blood at the corner. She marked every location on a physical map and pinned them with old surgical needles, each pin a ghost. The deeper she read, the more she saw the outlines of something bigger. Not just a theft, not just a cover-up, but an entire false operation. An operation designed to fail. Dyer's unit hadn't deserted. They'd been sacrificed. She followed the first coordinate north to an abandoned airfield choked with tumbleweeds. At first glance it was just ruins, broken hangars, rusted vehicles, graffiti scorched into concrete. But beneath the central hangar, in a space buried under collapsed beams and red dust, she found a sealed vault door. It took 3 hours of digging and half a tank of gas for the generator to grind it open. Inside, she found boxes, not of cash, but of files, names, service records, flight logs that didn't match any known missions, photos of men standing beside helicopters with no serial numbers, faces blurred, faces burned, and in the bottom drawer, under a stack of outdated communication reports, was a folder labeled Operation Brimfall. Inside were just three things: a single audio tape, a short redacted transcript, and a black and white photograph of 5 soldiers with red X's scratched across 4 of their faces. The 5th wasn't Dyer. It was a woman. Carmen stared at the photo. She didn't recognize the face, but something about her eyes, defiant, alert, made Carmen feel like she was staring into a mirror. The transcript was fragmented, but what remained told enough of the story. Extraction failed. No contact with forward unit. Directive to contain and erase. Priority. One asset no longer compliant. She closed the folder and sat in the dust for a long time, listening to the wind scrape the desert floor outside. She wasn't just retracing footsteps. She was stepping into the outline of a buried war. She moved from site to site, each more forgotten than the last. An old water purification facility turned clandestine meeting point. A collapsed ranger station used to traffic stolen gear. A desert church whose basement had once served as a field interrogation post. In each one, she found more pieces. Dyer's notes matched perfectly. She followed his written voice through the dust like a soldier herself, moving with caution, listening for movement in the shadows. The men who had found her at the ridge hadn't shown themselves again, but she knew they were watching. Sometimes she saw their tire tracks behind her. Once, a casing near her tent that hadn't been there the night before. They were keeping their distance, waiting, measuring her. Maybe they still didn't know what she had. Or maybe they were letting her do the work for them. It was at the 4th site, a communications relay buried under a fake utility substation, where she found something that made her blood run cold. Another vault, another stack of dusty files, but this time there was a page with her name on it. Alvarez, Carmen, civilian contractor, medically certified, former military base volunteer, Fort Daly, evaluated as low risk, high utility, surveillance recommended. And at the bottom, in thick red ink, conditional asset, flagged for possible activation. Carmen read the page 3 times before burning it in a rusty coffee can. Her hands shook as she watched the ash curl into the stale air. They had known about her long before Dyer had walked into that clinic. Maybe he hadn't chosen her at random. Maybe she was already part of this, another cog in the machine. Or maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated her. She took what she could from the site and vanished again into the desert. She didn't trust her truck anymore. She swapped it at an old contacts shop under an alias, taking a beaten-down off-road Jeep with no plates. She drove at night, slept in short, shallow bursts, kept a knife beneath her pillow and a loaded revolver in the glove box. She wasn't just retracing a dead man's steps now. She was outrunning live threats. Dyer hadn't surfaced again since that night in the bunker. She didn't know where he'd gone or what he was doing, but she felt him near, like a phantom guiding her steps. The notebook's final pages were different. Not maps, not coordinates, just questions, phrases, written and rewritten like mantras or code. How many lies make the truth? They buried it under our feet. Ghosts don't need graves. One sentence was circled over and over again. The last one isn't money. She found it on a Wednesday, 3 miles from a broken oil field marked with nothing but a crooked cross. The entrance was buried beneath an old bus turned sideways into the hill, as if someone had tried to crash into the earth itself. She dug beneath the tail end of the frame and found a steel hatch like the one at the tower. Inside, a spiral stairwell. She descended with her flashlight flickering, breath shallow, muscles ready to snap. The room at the bottom was a vault, but not for files, not for money, for bodies. Metal coffins, each sealed, each tagged. Soldiers, unclaimed, unnamed. Some missing parts, some burned, some still in uniform. She staggered through the maze of them, dizzy with nausea and rage. This wasn't cleanup, this was disposal. These were the ones who hadn't stayed silent. At the end of the row was an empty slab. A tag hung from the steel. It read simply, M. Dyer, empty, reserved. Carmen's heart thundered. He had come here. He had seen it. Maybe he had buried the others himself. Maybe he had made it his mission to bring their story to light. And he had given her everything. The map, the files, the trail. She reached into her pack, pulled out the dog tag, and placed it on the empty slab. "You deserve better," she whispered. "You all do." She stood, straightened her back, and turned toward the tunnel. She was done hiding, done running. She had names, evidence, proof. She was going to take it all to the surface. And if they tried to stop her, they would learn that they should have killed her when they had the chance. The first shot missed. It snapped past Carmen's ear as she reached the top of the stairwell, striking the metal hatch with a violent clang that echoed like a bell tolling for the dead. She didn't hesitate. She dove to the side, rolled beneath the overturned bus, drew her revolver, and pressed herself flat to the dirt. Her heart pounded in her throat. Another shot rang out, then silence. Not desert silence, hunting silence. She could feel eyes scanning the terrain, calculating her position. They hadn't waited long. They'd followed her, or maybe they'd known where she was going all along. A trap, one last insurance policy. Carmen gritted her teeth and kept low, crawling along the undercarriage of the rusted bus, her palms digging into sand and twisted metal. Her fingers brushed something near the rear axle, a pipe, corroded, hollow. She gripped it tight and waited. The wind picked up, and with it came the scuff of boots. One set, two, then a third. They were fanning out. She took a breath and moved. In a single motion, she slid out from beneath the vehicle and hurled the pipe to her left. It clanged down the slope, loud and sharp. The response was immediate. 2 shots fired toward the sound. She rose, pivoted, whoommed, and fired twice. The first man dropped with a grunt, caught in the thigh. The second whirled and returned fire, but she was already down again, sliding behind a half-buried oil drum. The third man, quiet, calculating, flanked. She heard him before she saw him, his shadow stretched over the edge of the bus. She didn't look up. She fired through the drum, a gamble. The bullet punched through the metal and struck meat. The man screamed and collapsed. Silence returned. Real this time. Carmen waited a full minute before emerging. The 2 wounded men were still breathing. One was unconscious. The other stared at her with a mixture of fear and hatred. She stepped over him, gun still raised. "Tell your boss," she said coldly. "I'm not burying anything." He didn't answer. She turned and walked to her Jeep. It was time to burn the evidence into the light. The press wouldn't touch the story. She expected that. Files went missing. Her emails bounced. Journalists stopped responding after initial interest. One even told her flat out that he'd been warned off. Carmen changed tactics. She posted documents anonymously, sent tapes to independent veterans groups, leaked location footage to ex-military whistleblowers. It took weeks. But cracks began to form, and then someone else picked up the torch. A former lieutenant who had served at Fort Daly in the late 80s came forward. Then a medic, then a pilot. Their stories matched. The names matched. The operations matched. And slowly, carefully, the weight of silence began to shift. Not all at once, but enough. She went on the run again after that. She knew they wouldn't stop trying. The triangle, their symbol, appeared once on a motel wall, once carved into the hood of her Jeep, a reminder, a warning. But she didn't flinch, because she wasn't alone anymore. Others had joined her, quietly, patients she'd treated, journalists she'd protected, soldiers who remembered. They called themselves the Circle, a reclamation of the symbol Dyer had drawn at the end. They carried no weapons, only truth. Files, names, maps, evidence, stories. One night, Carmen sat beneath a canyon sky, staring up at stars unblurred by city light. Dyer's notebook sat open in her lap. Its pages were nearly full now, not just his notes, but hers, sketches, coordinates, witness accounts. She reached for her pen and wrote a final line at the bottom of the last page. Buried things don't stay buried forever. Then she tucked the notebook into her coat and stood. The trail ahead wasn't safe, but it was open, and she was ready to walk it. Because one night, long ago, a man with no tongue had bled onto her exam table and handed her a message the world wasn't ready for. And she had listened. That had been the beginning. But this was the war. She didn't return to the desert right away. After the ambush, Carmen vanished into the system. Backdoor IDs, burner phones, cash-only motels with flickering neon signs and bed sheets that smelled like mildew and dust. She changed her name 3 times in a month. Every time she walked through a door, she scanned corners, mirrors, windows. Her senses were sharpened, not by fear, but by experience. She wasn't hunted out of weakness now. She was watched because she was winning. The notebook stayed with her, always zipped into the lining of her backpack or taped beneath drawers. She memorized its pages at night, eyes burning under dull bulbs in silence, reading until the notes echoed in her bones. The buried body vault had changed something in her. Seeing the names, the coffins, the cold steel where voices once lived, it wasn't just wrong. It was monstrous. This wasn't about one missing payroll anymore. It wasn't even about Dyer. This was about a lie woven through 3 decades of military cleanup. A cover-up so deep and wide it needed ghosts to protect it. Carmen had a decision to make. She could keep playing safe, feeding leaks to sympathetic ears, hoping someone eventually took the bait. Or she could escalate, strike first, bring it down herself. She chose the second. The first move was Fort Daly. She returned to it under a new identity, posing as a medic volunteer, revisiting old base locations for a documentary project. No one questioned her. The guards were younger now, and the base was technically retired. A skeleton crew handled archive maintenance and occasional drills, but no one expected activity from someone like her. She slipped in with the tour group and peeled off during a fire alarm. Dyer's map had marked a sub-basement sealed decades earlier. A storage wing never transferred to digital records. The hallway was dark, cold, and silent. Her flashlight bounced across doors until she found it. Archive 7B. Inside, file cabinets older than her mother. She pulled drawer after drawer, searching for names she'd memorized. Crew from Operation Brimfall, drivers, supervisors, mechanics. Most were missing. Entire gaps existed where records should have been. But one file remained. Thin, water-damaged, but intact. Subject, Captain Elias Braden. Role, Logistics Commander. Status, deceased, self-inflicted gunshot. Carmen read the death report twice. He'd died 3 months after the Fort Daly theft. No autopsy, no photos, no investigation. A signature she didn't recognize marked the approval line, Colonel T. Garrison. She took a photo of the file and slipped out before anyone noticed. The second move came 3 nights later. She found Garrison, retired, living under a new name in a gated community outside Tucson. She didn't approach him directly. She sent him a copy of the file. No message, just the document, the photo of the mass grave slab marked with Dyer's name, and a printout of the first page of the notebook. She watched from her car as he read it. His hands trembled. He burned the envelope in a metal bowl on his porch, but didn't call anyone. The next day, he left town. Carmen tracked him to an old VA hospital 2 hours north, where he checked in under his real name. That night, she left another copy of the notebook in his mailbox, this one with an added note. You have a chance to fix it. Don't die silent. 3 days later, an anonymous tip reached a military oversight board. It triggered a cold case reopening. Carmen's name wasn't in the file. Dyer's was. They called it a coincidence. Carmen knew better. The next few weeks blurred again. She moved from city to city, watching the cracks widen. More files leaked. More silence broke. The people behind the symbol, the triangle that had haunted her, weren't ghosts anymore. They were afraid. And afraid people made mistakes. One night, a man tried to corner her in a motel parking lot. He wore tactical gear, said nothing, pulled a knife, not a gun, cleaner that way. Carmen didn't run. She disarmed him in seconds, left him broken on the pavement, took his phone. The call log had one contact listed only as gatekeeper. She texted from the phone, "You're losing." There was no reply. The deeper she went, the more she learned how far the rot had spread. The Brimfall theft wasn't a random act. It had been orchestrated. Dyer and his men were scapegoats. The real payroll had been diverted, hidden, and repurposed to fund private operations, black sites, deniable missions, asset disappearances. When Dyer buried the money, he wasn't just hiding cash. He was locking away proof, and when he lost his tongue, they thought he'd lost his voice. They underestimated him and her. Carmen didn't need weapons to win. She needed records. She needed truth. And now she had both. But the fight wasn't over. The circle, the network of allies, survivors, and whistleblowers she had stitched together in the shadows, began feeding her intel. A name surfaced: Alan Keswick, civilian contractor, logistics architect, quietly retired. No official military service, but his fingerprints were all over Brimfall. He had handled the rerouting of the payroll. He had written the off-book orders. And according to one source, he had visited Fort Daly twice in the last year. Carmen found him in a coastal estate protected by a high wall and private guards. She didn't go in, guns blazing. She sent him a photo, a single image, the empty slab with Dyer's name. That night, a fire broke out at Keswick's house. Arson suspected. He vanished. But a safe deposit box in his name surfaced in Las Vegas. Its contents: 2 cassette tapes, a list of project code names, and a sealed envelope addressed to the one who listened. Inside the envelope, a hand-drawn triangle, cracked down the center, and the words, "We were wrong." The wind shifted after that. News agencies stopped ignoring the leaks. A former Army colonel went on record. A documentary crew started filming near the ridge where Carmen had first dug. They didn't know the whole story. They never would. But they knew something had happened, that people had died, that something had been buried, literally, and that someone had tried to stop it from surfacing. Carmen stayed in the shadows. She wasn't looking for fame. She didn't want medals. She wanted memory. She wanted the silence broken so loud it could never return. And she wanted Dyer's sacrifice to matter. She made one final trip to the vault. The slab marked with his name had changed. Someone, maybe him, had carved something new beneath it. A circle, complete. Below it, truth finds a voice. She stood there for a long time, the sun rising over the desert. The same desert that once kept secrets in its sand now warmed her face. She could feel it. This was the end of the trail, the final page of the notebook, the last unturned stone. She reached into her bag and pulled out one last item, the napkin, the first map. Dried, blood-stained, the ink faded but intact. She unfolded it and placed it gently atop the slab. Then She whispered, "I heard you." And she walked away. The world would keep moving. Governments would keep lying. Ghosts would keep whispering. But one story had been unearthed. One truth had found light. Because Carmen Alvarez, a medic from a forgotten desert clinic, had chosen to help a man with no voice. And in doing so, she became the voice for all the others buried beneath. Carmen spent the following weeks off-grid, a ghost within her own country, shifting between dusty border towns and forgotten roadside diners where no one asked names and the coffee always tasted like burnt secrets. She'd become an urban myth in some circles already, the woman with the desert maps, they whispered, or the medic who dug too deep. And though she rarely heard it firsthand, she could feel it in the way strangers sometimes glanced over their shoulders before asking for a lighter, in how her burner phones rang once in the night and then never again. She wore the silence like armor now, familiar and tight across her ribs. The Dyer notebook never left her sight. She had photocopied every page, scanned each one onto encrypted drives, distributed redundant copies across storage lockers in 3 states. If they came for her again, and she had no doubt they wouldn't be able to erase the trail. She had gone too far, pulled too many threads, woken too many ghosts. The most recent ghost came from a name she hadn't expected, Lieutenant Avery LeClaire. Dyer had mentioned him once in the notes, just a passing reference, but when Carmen dug deeper, she found an entire hidden thread. LeClaire had been part of a separate unit assigned to recover assets from the Fort Daly payroll theft after the operation went black. Officially, his squad had been dissolved. Unofficially, they'd vanished in southern New Mexico just weeks after the buried vault had gone silent. She tracked down his sister, Lorraine, in a care home outside Santa Fe, a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes and a Bible by her nightstand. Lorraine didn't know much, but she remembered one thing with striking clarity. Her brother had mailed her a package 2 days before he vanished. It was intercepted. She never saw what was inside. But she remembered the return address, Coyote Wells, NM, an unlisted grid point. Carmen didn't wait. She drove south overnight, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the desert dark, her hands gripping the wheel like it might try to escape. Coyote Wells wasn't on any modern map, no road signs, no gas stations, just a barbed wire fence at the end of a crumbling stretch of highway and a rusted sign that said, simply, "No trespassing, federal land." Beyond it, the land dipped into a shallow basin, dry grass and sand, stretching like the skin of an old drum. She left the Jeep behind, took only the essentials, canteen, sidearm, the notebook, a crowbar, and climbed over the fence. The landscape felt wrong, too quiet. No birds, no wind. The sun had just begun to rise when she found it, a concrete hatch in the ground, hidden beneath an iron sheet half buried in sand. She pried it open. A ladder descended into shadow. At the bottom the air was colder, like the earth itself had swallowed the heat. She clicked on her flashlight. The beam caught a hallway, narrow, dirt-walled, reinforced with aging wood beams. Old military, not permanent. She moved carefully, every footstep sinking slightly into the dust. The hallway ended in a chamber, square, maybe 10 by 10 feet. It was empty, except for 2 things, a metal locker and a skeleton sitting upright against the far wall, still dressed in a decaying uniform, dog tags long rusted, but still readable, LT, A. LeClaire. Carmen knelt, breath caught in her throat. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She touched her hand to her heart and whispered, "I'm sorry," then turned to the locker. Inside, she found a small fireproof box, locked. The key was still in LeClaire's pocket, hanging from the tags. She opened it. Inside, microfilm, sealed, labeled with red tape, Operation Glasswell, Black Vault number 12, observer footage. She held it to the light and saw flickers of grainy footage, trucks pulling up to a desert site, crates being buried, men with covered faces unloading not just money but something else, larger, heavier. Carmen stared. The footage ended with a shot of a document, a manifest. She couldn't read it in full, but she saw enough to recognize a logo, Department of Defense, and below it the words, "Recovered non-human biological materials. Do not catalog." Her mouth went dry. She read it again. The microfilm wasn't just about stolen payroll. It was about something else buried alongside it, something no one wanted unearthed. Carmen replaced the film in the box, sealed it, and stood up. The ground beneath her feet felt different now, charged, like it remembered. She climbed out of the shaft, resealed the hatch, and didn't stop moving until she was 2 counties away. That night, in a motel where the water ran brown and the curtains smelled like smoke, Carmen reviewed the footage again under a scanner she'd kept hidden in a hollowed-out first aid kit. The resolution was poor, but the implication was clear. Fort Daly hadn't just been a military post. It had been a front for deeper recoveries. The payroll was real, but it had been the cover story. The transport wasn't just cash. It was materials, unknown, dangerous, never filed. And Dyer had buried it, not to protect himself, but to protect others. Carmen's mind reeled. She wrote for hours, filling 3 more pages in the notebook. The triangle symbol appeared again, marked on the side of one of the transport crates in the film. But this one had been crossed out. Beneath it, someone had scrawled, "Not ready, not safe, not human." By sunrise, she knew she couldn't do this alone. She reached out to the Circle, the underground network she'd helped build in shadows. They mobilized in days. Journalists, ex-military, investigators. One by one they came to her, bringing files, photos, testimonies, fragments of the same story told across different decades. Together, they pieced it into something monstrous. The truth was too big for a single thread. It wove through Cold War panic, foreign black sites, crashed objects in deserts, both foreign and domestic, and always back to that triangle. They called it Project Nell. No formal records, no chain of command, just an open-ended directive: secure, silence, suppress. The soldiers tasked with the operation were never told the full story. Dyer hadn't known what he was transporting, but when he saw the crate open, when he saw what was inside, he had run. The others didn't make it. One tried to report it, vanished. Another tried to sell the footage, shot. Dyer cut out his own tongue. According to a field medic's journal, Carmen uncovered, not in fear but in protest. So he wouldn't be forced to speak again. So they couldn't make him say what he had seen. Carmen stood on the edge of it now, staring into a history built on lies so deep they had their own gravity. The only question was whether she would expose it or become part of the dust covering it. She chose to speak. The Circle helped release the microfilm, digitized it, watermarked it with the names of the dead, sent it to every outlet they could. Most buried it. A few ran it. And then something unexpected happened. A whistleblower from inside the current Pentagon reached out. Codename Shepard. He sent 2 files. One confirmed Project Nell's existence. The other was a transcript from 1987. Field Unit, Fort Daly. The speaker? Sergeant M. Dyer, recorded secretly before he vanished. It was 1 sentence, 5 words. "We brought back the wrong thing." Carmen read the line again and again. She knew then that the buried vaults weren't just graves, they were warnings. She burned the original napkin map in a canyon fire that night, not in surrender, but as a message to the men still watching her. "You failed. We found it. We remember." And somewhere deep beneath a forgotten ridge, a crate still rested beneath layers of stone and memory, sealed tight, humming faintly against the earth's bones. Carmen never tried to recover it. She didn't need to. The truth wasn't in the vault anymore. It was in the air, in the names she'd carved into the world, in the silence she had shattered with nothing but her hands, a dead man's notebook, and the choice to listen when no one else would. The sun had begun to rise over the vast spine of the Sierra Luna when Carmen climbed to the summit of the ridge the locals called the place that hears. No one could tell her why. The name was old, passed down by desert drifters, nomads, former miners who spoke of echoes that returned answers no one had asked for. She stood there now, boot soles pressed into ancient rock, looking down at the basin below where her final lead pointed, a formation that once served as a forward observation post during the Brimfall era, but had since been swallowed by shifting dunes and government silence. Her breath steamed in the cold morning air. The notebook, now full and weathered like scripture, was wrapped tightly in her pack. She had added 2 more names to its final pages the night before, LeClaire and Keswick. One dead, one disappeared, both trying to write something they could never completely understand. Carmen didn't pretend to understand it either, not fully. She just knew the trail ended here, that whatever Dyer had buried under the pretense of payroll had started here, and if it was going to end, it would end the same way, deep in the dirt with blood, heat, and someone finally brave enough to name it. She descended the ridge before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The air grew hotter with every step. The wind picked up grains of sand and whispered them against her jacket sleeves like secrets trying to break free. The terrain below didn't match any existing map, but the lines Dyer had drawn matched perfectly. 3 sinkholes, an arc of dead brush, a collapsed bunker half swallowed by time. At the center, a patch of earth too flat to be natural. She knew what that meant. Something below. Carmen dropped her pack, took out the compact ground-penetrating radar device she'd smuggled from an old geology contact, and powered it up. She swept the site slowly, methodically, watching the tablet screen as her footsteps traced loops. There, a void, rectangular, deep, reinforced. Not natural. She marked the edges and began to dig. It took 3 hours to get through the first layer. The sand gave way to hardened soil, then metal, corroded, cold, and wide. She cleared the top, found a hatch beneath the dirt, and pried it open with a crowbar, the shriek of old hinges splitting the desert quiet in 2. The air that rushed out was stale, dry but not dead. Something had been sealed here intentionally. She dropped a flare. It fell and landed with a soft echo, 5 meters deep. She climbed down. The room below wasn't a room. It was a chamber, circular, designed not for utility, but for containment. The walls were lined with old plating, scorched in places, covered with a resin she didn't recognize. In the center stood a box, a single crate, identical in size to the ones in the microfilm footage, marked with a symbol that chilled her even now, the cracked triangle, the ancient warning. But something was different. The crate had been broken open. She froze. Her flashlight traced the inside of the box. Empty. Dustless. The interior walls were scraped, as if something once inside had pushed out from within. Carmen's stomach turned. She reached for the recorder in her bag and began dictating notes. The layout, dimensions, condition. She had to document it. Someone had to know. Then she saw the writing, not on the crate, on the wall behind it. Carved, messy, fresh. It still listens. Carmen stepped back. The silence in the chamber suddenly felt awake. She turned and climbed quickly back to the surface, adrenaline flooding her system. She reached the top, heart pounding. The wind had stopped. The ridge above her cast a long shadow down the slope. And in the distance, on the far edge of the basin, she saw movement. 3 figures watching. She didn't wait. She packed the recorder, sealed the hatch again, and erased every visible trace of her presence. Then she made for the ridge, moving fast, heart a drumbeat inside her skull. When she reached the crest, the figures below hadn't moved, but they weren't following. They were waiting, as if they had been watching to see whether she'd open it, as if they'd seen it opened before. She reached the Jeep and drove without stopping, back through canyon roads and winding desert stretches, not toward a destination, but away. as far away as she could. But something followed. Not in the mirror, not on the road. Inside. A weight, a sense, a presence. It wasn't a thing with claws or eyes or words. It was something else. A knowing. It had heard her, and it remembered. The wind no longer felt like wind. It felt like breath. The circle disbanded 3 weeks later. Not officially, not dramatically. They just stopped answering. One by one, they ghosted from the chat rooms, vanished from burner phones, even Shepard. Carmen sent pings, messages, code phrases. Nothing came back. Her last safe house in Nevada was compromised. She left that night and never went back. Her final message to the outside world was a flash drive. Encrypted, sent anonymously to a journalist in Berlin who specialized in whistleblower intelligence. It contained the footage, the vault recordings, Dyer's original map, her scanned copy of the full notebook, and a video, just her face, recorded from inside a moving car, eyes tired but steady. "I don't know what I've unleashed," she said, "but it's listening. It's always been listening. The man without a tongue tried to warn us, and I was foolish enough to dig it up. Whatever was buried with that payroll, whatever was inside that crate, it didn't die. It waited. And now it's awake. You have a choice. You can bury this again, or you can finally face it." She paused, then spoke Dyer's final words. "We brought back the wrong thing." She hit send. She disappeared the next day. The journalist released the footage. Half the world called it fiction. The other half didn't know what to think, but a few, just a few, recognized the triangle. And one of them had seen it before, etched in a cave wall in a country that no longer existed, carved above a door sealed shut with ancient stone. And beneath it, in a language no one had spoken in 3,000 years, a phrase translated as, "Do not ask questions you cannot silence." And now the questions were awake, and the silence had broken. Carmen didn't stop moving after the upload. The moment the video went live, she abandoned the motel in Wyoming, drove west through 2 states using back roads and fake plates, tossed the burner phone into a gorge, and checked into a roadside inn under the name Evelyn Mercado, a name she'd only used once before, during her earliest days in the investigation, when she'd thought the danger was government agents or old soldiers, not something older, not something watching from below. The air was different now. The notebook, now digitized and distributed, no longer felt like a possession. It was legacy. It was the record of the dead, the screaming of a man who'd lost his tongue and still somehow roared across decades. But even with the world watching, the shadows didn't stop. She started seeing the symbol, always in 3s. A triangle scratched into a gas pump in Oregon. A cracked version etched into a park bench she sat on for less than 10 minutes. Even once on the rim of her coffee cup, traced into the cardboard like someone had pressed it in while she wasn't looking. She began waking in the night with pressure on her chest. No sound, just the sensation of being watched. The circle was gone. No one answered. The last message she received from Shepard simply read, "They were here. I didn't speak. I won't. Be ready." And then silence. That silence stretched for weeks. She stayed off-grid, then on-grid, just to confuse them. She mailed decoy drives to herself across the country, rerouted her GPS pings through 3 VPNs, but something was always just behind her, never chasing, only waiting. That was the worst part. It never hunted. It waited. She began to dream about Dyer. Not just him bleeding in the clinic, not just his silent desperation as he drew the map, but dreams of him before, young, clean, in uniform, digging, always digging. His face was different in these dreams, not broken, not mute, but alive and afraid. And always when he looked at her, he mouthed the same thing, "I tried." Carmen began to wonder if the silence wasn't just in the world, but in herself, that maybe she'd gone too far, touched something she was never meant to uncover. Then A letter arrived. No postage. Just slid under her motel door in the middle of the night. Inside was a photograph. Grainy, black and white. The same desert ridge where she had uncovered the last vault. But in this version, there were 6 figures standing around the hatch. One was Dyer. 2 she recognized from old dossiers, LeClaire and Braden. The other 3 were unfamiliar, but one wore a civilian suit. He was holding a clipboard, and in red pen across the top of the photo, someone had written, "They never left." Carmen stared at that photo for hours, not just because of the message, but because behind the 6 men, in the far corner of the shot, barely visible through the dust, was a shadow. Tall, thin, wrong. It didn't look human. It wasn't facing the camera, but it was watching them, watching the watchers. Carmen flipped the photo over. One more message. Don't dig again. She lit it on fire in the sink. But her hands trembled for an hour. She relocated again, this time to a cabin in northern Idaho, surrounded by pine and frost and no cell towers. For a time, she felt safe. The silence didn't weigh so heavy. She chopped her own firewood, slept dreamlessly, wrote long-form entries in a new notebook, one not meant for the world. Personal entries, reflections, what Dyer had sacrificed, how easily the truth slipped between cracks, what it meant to carry a story that wasn't hers but had somehow chosen her. She thought of the box in the vault, the one that had already been opened. What had been inside? What did it mean that someone had written, "It still listens," inside a chamber designed to contain? That wasn't a warning. That was a confession, and it haunted her more than the footage, the corpses, or the guns. Because you can run from a lie, but not from something that listens. Winter closed in. Weeks passed. She didn't speak to another person. She started hearing the woods breathe. Not wind, not trees, breathing. She kept the revolver on her bedside table and a hunting rifle beside the door. But neither felt useful. Not against silence. Then, one night, she opened the closet in the back room, the one she never used, and found the triangle scratched into the wall. Fresh. She packed that night. No goodbyes, no second thoughts. She burned the cabin to the ground, left the woods, drove south, fast. For the first time since the map, she felt hunted. She changed vehicles, dumped the rifle, bought a train ticket under a new alias, and crossed into New Mexico. Returned to the first clinic where Dyer had collapsed into her arms. It had been closed down, boarded up since she vanished. She broke in through the rear door, dust on every surface, the scent of antiseptic long gone. She walked to the exam table where he had laid, sat beside it, closed her eyes, listened, and finally, after all this time, the silence broke, not with a sound, but with a thought, a memory, a truth. It was never about the money. The payroll was real, but it was the where, not the what, that mattered. The convoy had taken a route that intersected an old archaeological dig, one buried by the military in the 40s after a team of researchers discovered bones that didn't match any known species. The Brimfall unit hadn't just moved cash. They'd moved cargo pulled from that dig site, biological material, ancient, not human, not living, but not inert either. Dyer had seen it. That's what had broken him. Carmen stood, stunned. It all fit. The files, the vaults, the triangle, even the silence. It wasn't emptiness. It was suppression. A quiet, so intentional, so deep, it rewrote memory. Whatever had been unearthed decades ago, it didn't need soldiers. It needed secrets. She pulled the last photograph from her bag, the one she hadn't shown anyone, the shadow in the corner. She stared, zoomed, squinted, and finally saw what she had missed. The shadow had hands, but too many fingers, its head bent at an impossible angle, and its feet weren't touching the ground. She tore it up, burned it, left the clinic and never returned. The story was no longer hers to tell. She had pushed it into the light. The rest of the world would have to decide what to do with it. But as for her, Carmen Alvarez vanished one final time. Some say she crossed the border. Others say she was taken. But those who knew, those who listened, kept the notebook alive, shared it, studied it. And one by one, they began to hear it too. The thing Dyer tried to stop, the thing buried deeper than money, deeper than lies, something not born from earth but buried in its skin. It listens, it remembers, and now it waits. She made her final stand in a place that wasn't on any map, a ghost town called Harlan's Rift, tucked between red canyons and cliffs so dry they cracked like old skin. It was the kind of place where radios only picked up static, where abandoned mines stretched beneath the ground like veins, where buildings collapsed in on themselves out of sheer loneliness. Carmen didn't come here to hide. She came because the signal brought her, not a GPS ping, not a voice on the line, a frequency, low, irregular, humming in her skull like the sound of teeth grinding. It had started the day she burned the last photo. A pressure, a knowing. She understood it now, what "it listens" had meant. It wasn't just a phrase. It was literal, the thing buried beneath the earth, the thing that came back in pieces through transport crates and locked boxes and mislabeled files. It wasn't dead. It wasn't dormant. It was awareness. And she had spoken too many names, dug too many vaults, remembered too much. The old government facilities that had once housed remnants of it had all been sealed, flooded, or collapsed. But the last one, Vault 9, was rumored to lie beneath Harlan's Rift. And Carmen knew, as surely as she knew her own heartbeat, that it wasn't a vault for storage. It was a prison. She arrived under moonlight, the jeep rattling over broken asphalt. The town was silent except for the whisper of wind moving through old porches and hollowed door frames. Her headlights washed over cracked signage, a rusted playground, a sheriff's office where windows hung like open mouths. She parked and cut the engine. For a long time, she just sat there, listening. Nothing. Then, barely audible, the hum again. She followed it on foot, walking past collapsed homes and dry wells until she reached the church at the edge of town. It was mostly ruins now, just a skeletal frame of burned beams and a shattered bell on the ground. But beneath the altar, through a half-collapsed floor, she found a staircase. Stone, ancient. The steps weren't made by this town. They were older, carved by hands that didn't move like ours. Her flashlight caught strange symbols on the walls, not letters, not language, but patterns that almost moved when you looked too long. She descended without hesitation. At the bottom, a doorway, steel, reinforced, blasted once, maybe during a containment breach. Its edges were blackened, warped. She squeezed through. The chamber inside was enormous, circular. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the desert. Machines lined the walls, long since dead. In the center, a platform, and on it, the final crate. Not opened, not damaged. Whole. Sealed with a lock Carmen had seen in a photo Dyer once drew and then tore from the notebook. It was real. The thing inside, still untouched, still sleeping. She approached it slowly. The hum was inside her skull now. Behind her eyes, a rhythm too deliberate to be anything but sentient. She placed her hand on the crate. It was warm. Not from heat, from memory. It knew her. She whispered, "You were never supposed to come back." The hum stopped. Total silence. Then a whisper, not through air, but through her bones. It spoke no words, just presence. and it asked the oldest question in the world, "Will you carry me?" Carmen didn't answer. She stepped back. She had thought for so long that this journey was about revealing the truth, breaking the silence, honoring the dead. But this wasn't about memory. It was about containment. Dyer hadn't failed. He had sealed it, buried it, trusted her not to dig it up, but to find it and choose differently. Carmen walked backward to the stairwell, never turning her back on the crate. When she reached the door, she took the last flare from her pack and lit it. Then she pulled the pin from a demolition charge salvaged from the earlier vault site. She tossed it inside and ran. The explosion shook the ground. Sand collapsed in waves. The crate, the chamber, the knowledge, buried again. Not erased, not destroyed, but unreachable. She stood in the dust, watching the ground settle, her lungs burning, her heart louder than the hum had ever been. The wind returned, normal, empty, earthly. She turned and walked back to the jeep. Weeks passed. No more signals, no more dreams. No more triangle symbols scratched into metal or scrawled across walls in the dark. The circle never resurfaced. The world moved on. The story fell beneath layers of conspiracy and silence once again. But Carmen didn't disappear this time. She resurfaced quietly. In a border town clinic near El Paso, under her real name, no aliases, no charade. She treated coughs and wounds and dehydration, and every now and then she'd look out across the desert and remember the man who arrived on her table, tongue gone, chest bleeding, but still determined to be heard, and she would whisper to the wind, "I kept it down. I kept it closed." She still wore the dog tag some days, not Dyer's, her own now, engraved with only 4 words, buried, watched, remembered, refused, because she had refused. When the silence broke, she had listened. When the vault opened, she had sealed it. When the story tried to pull her under, she had told it, and then walked away. The final page of the notebook remained blank, on purpose. Not everything needed to be written. Some truths weren't secrets, they were burdens, and not everyone deserved to carry them. The desert winds still passed through Aretas. The church remained collapsed, the staircase gone, buried, like the rest. But if you stood in the basin long enough, if you listened hard enough, you might still hear it, the hum deep below, faint, patient, waiting. But no one came anymore. Because the only map that mattered was the one never drawn, the one carried in the silence between one act of courage and the next. And Carmen had chosen in the end not to draw it. She had chosen mercy over curiosity, containment over fame. And the world, for now, kept turning. Because one woman patched up a man with no tongue, and then chose to listen instead of speak. Years later, the story had become legend. In online forums buried behind encryption and clearance, in worn notebooks passed between veterans who never signed their names, and in the private collections of archivists who specialized in things that didn't officially exist, whispers of Carmen Alvarez persisted like embers. Most thought she'd died. Some said she went deeper, beyond even the final vault, leaving behind not just the world, but herself. A few believed she had been taken by whatever it was she'd found in that box sealed under Harlan's rift. But those who knew, the few remaining survivors of Project Brimfall's shadow legacy, they never forgot her, and they never spoke of her loudly. Because the deeper truth, the part no one wanted to face, was that the operation hadn't ended with silence. It had ended with choice, Carmen's choice, and the silence that followed was not suppression, it was protection. The government's official records on Fort Daly were eventually scrubbed. Satellite imaging over the Harlan's Rift region showed only dunes and fractured canyon lines, no hint of Vault 9, no crate, no trace. But the hum never entirely stopped. It would return in pulses, barely detectable interference on shortwave radio bands, strange static patterns on desert security cameras, silent blackouts in geothermal sensors stationed near tectonic faults. Engineers blamed solar flares, others blamed outdated tech. But those who'd been in the field long enough knew better. They called it Echo 9. Not a glitch, not a fault. A signature. Carmen had left her mark, not through exposure, but through memory, the kind that endures because it was earned, not shared. At a research library in Nevada, an old man visited once a year. He never gave a name. He only asked to see the same file, declassified document number 473K Delta, containing a grainy black and white photo of 5 soldiers, one of whom had no name listed. Every year he stared at the photo. Every year he'd whisper, "You kept your promise." Then he'd leave, disappearing before the staff could even ask where he was from. The librarian who first noted his visit later found a single note scrawled on a returned book. Sometimes keeping the box closed is the bravest thing of all. 10 years to the day after Carmen sealed the vault, a team of desert rangers discovered a journal buried under a cairn 20 miles from Harlan's Rift. The handwriting was tight, deliberate. The final entry was brief. The silence was never empty. It was mercy. If you're reading this, remember, it was a voice that saved you, not a weapon, a voice. There were no coordinates, no name, just that final message. It was archived and forgotten by most, but someone made a copy, and it circulated. In the years that followed, small things began to happen. A whistleblower in Norway referenced a box that no one had ever seen, but which featured in dozens of blacked-out reports. A seismic anomaly under Chile was traced to a pattern identical to the one Carmen recorded on her last ground-penetrating scan. A linguist in Peru found a temple wall etched with the same 3-fingered symbol seen in the shadow behind Dyer's photograph. And through it all, a pattern reemerged, a circle enclosing a triangle, cracked in 2. The symbol became myth, then warning, then premonition. Not a call to arms, a call to restraint, because in a world obsessed with discovery, one woman made the radical choice to stop, and in doing so she saved more than she would ever know. Somewhere, buried beneath silence and stone, something old remains still, listening, but it never speaks, because Carmen did not let it. She patched the wound. She became the keeper. And the world for now sleeps peacefully above the vault she chose not to open twice.